This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On Air.
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. I hope you're all doing well. This episode is gonna be meaty. I know I say this for every single episode, but we're really gonna get into it. I mean, we're talking free speech, we're talking safety, we're talking institutions and powers, which I feel like we do every episode, but I really like the angle that we're going to tackle it at today. And I think what we're going to be getting into today is something that keeps happening time and time again across, pop culture, art, politics, and what it really is the institutional panic when, marginalised voices become visible. And, when you look at the pattern, there's also a pattern of language that is used when this does keep happening. And, we keep hearing, we're protecting the people, or, this isn't the right time. This could be harmful. We need to remain neutral. But when you really get into it and look at this pattern for what it is, what these moments are really about is who gets to speak, who gets listened to, and who gets told to wait their turn. And I really wanted to do this episode after everything that went down with Adelaide Writers Week, and then also in a very different way, but also at the core of it is quite similar, the reaction to Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance. And, they're different in the sense that one kind of happened in the literature world, and one was more music, pop culture, but I think it kind of hits the same vein of, when marginalised people speak too clearly, institutions get nervous. And I have spoken about free speech before on the show, but I think the reoccurring patterns, because I've kind of, when everything went down with the Adelaide Writers Week and the reaction to Bad Bunny's performance, I was like, there's definitely a pattern here, and I really want to break down this pattern because this will not be the last time this happens. It will keep happening time and time again, and I think how we approach this pattern and how we break it down and how we choose to respond to it, it will give us a lot of food for thought, and it will, take us to a path where we can have really deep conversations about our institutions and our systems, and where is that power. And so, this episode is not just about free speech. It's that balance between free speech and cultural safety. It is the dynamic between representation and power, and how, we don't actually have any avenues to talk about, the discomfort or the other strong emotions that come up, and because we don't have any good avenues to, as a society or as a community, to get together and talk about these things, this discomfort is really treated like it's a danger, and I think it's really important to talk about that. And sorry folks, just a heads up, my voice sounds a little bit funky at the moment. I'm not too sure if I would classify it as a sexy rasp. It is a rasp nevertheless, and I'm pushing through and recording anyway. Just slightly recovering from something, so please do not mind my raspy voice for this episode today. But before we actually get into what, about free speech and cultural safety and representation and power, let's anchor ourselves and unpack what happened with Adelaide Writers' Week. So the Writers' Week announced that Palestinian Australian author Randa Abdul Fattah would no longer be on the panel, and the board behind the Writers' Week, they cited, concerns about cultural sensitivity following the Bondi Beach attack that happened towards the end of last year. And that was a direct attack on the Jewish community. And, I think however you feel about the decision that was made about the board, what I really want to focus on in this kōrero is, the reasoning behind the decision, because I think that's where the meat of the conversation lies rather than the decision itself. So if you really pay attention to what was said and what wasn't said by the board indirectly, it's really it's really revealing in my opinion, because the board didn't say that Randa had violated a code of conduct. They didn't say that Randa had made violent statements. They cited concerns which basically said her presence might be too upsetting. And I think, that the reasoning for this decision is really, really important, because what it's saying is that the board isn't responding to speech or, an action. They're responding to fear of reaction, which is insane. And just to give more context behind why that fear of reaction is even more insane, is because the Bondi Beach attack was a direct attack toward the Jewish community, but here you have a Palestinian author that would then apparently cause a kind of cultural sensitivity, which is insane, because indirectly, it's putting blame and fueling, fueling this fear and this hate that already exists, which is insane. And I don't think the board was ready for the reaction that came after that, because within days, writers began to withdraw, and eventually there was 180 speakers that withdrew. The program absolutely collapsed. I'm pretty sure the event did not go ahead. The board resigned, the director resigned, and there was a lot of talk online when this was going down. But I think one that really stood out was, if one writer can be silenced, all writers are vulnerable. And it's insane because, writing and reading books, just literature in general, it's all about storytelling and dialogue and, being exposed to all of these different stories and writing them. So a literary institution built on dialogue, the whole event and everything collapsed because of avoidance. And so they tried to remove this quote-unquote controversy, instead of, creating space to kind of have a Palestinian-Australian author contribute to this Writers' Week, and, the response to the board's decision, I think what people were reacting to was the fact that, this decision was presented as if it was about cultural safety, but it wasn't. It was censorship kind of wrapped in this politeness, which is absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. Even though this happened a couple of months ago now, I still think, I still just cannot believe that it happened, to be honest. I still cannot believe that it happened. And I think what makes it even more insane for me personally is that, of course, the Bondi Beach attack was awful, and I condemn what happened, and my heart hurts for the Jewish community. It's actually so terrifying and traumatizing when your community is intentionally sought out like that in a malicious and hurtful, violent manner. That's something that I acutely felt after the March terrorist attack in Ōtautahi. For that to happen in Aotearoa, and for that terrorist to specifically target the Muslim community, and it's an awful feeling, and it's a feeling that I hope that most people, no one would have to ever feel or understand, but unfortunately it's happened, it's happening, and if things don't change in our world, it will continue to happen. So I absolutely condemn what happened at Bondi Beach. Absolutely awful. And then for the board behind the Writers' Week to kind of when something like that happens, when a big rupture like that happens, repair is important. I think that's where the resilience and that cohesiveness, there's an opportunity for that to happen in the repair. But this decision did not contribute to any repair at all, because, there were a lot of tensions and inflammation when the Bondi Beach attack happened. Even before it was confirmed who the terrorist was in that case, people were making all types of comments and really saying awful things about the Muslim community, about the Palestinian community. Absolutely awful. And that rhetoric is not helpful in any way, shape or form. It is motivated by even more hate. So for the board behind the Adelaide Writers' Week to make this decision considering that context, it is really, really harmful. But for it to come across as cultural safety, I think is quite damaging. It is, censorship wrapped in politeness, which is insane. Absolutely insane. And, to pivot to a similar story but a different stage, let's talk about Bad Bunny. When Bad Bunny performed at the Super Bowl, he bought it all. That was the way that I have been watching it every single day since it came out. Oh, mwah, mwah, mwah. Chef's kiss, 10 out of 10. But you know what? He brought Spanish language, Latin rhythms, Puerto Rican identity, and there was a lot of migration symbolism in his performance, a lot of working class aesthetics, and all of this was happening on the most watched broadcast in America. And you know, even before the performance, there was so much backlash. I mean, whenever it was announced that Bad Bunny was going to be performing for the Super Bowl, a lot of backlash. You know, a lot of people saying it wasn't American, even though Puerto Rico is part of America. But I mean, tomato, apparently. It's too political. It's inappropriate. How can you have someone speaking Spanish to represent America and to be performing at the Super Bowl? Why bring identity into sports? You know, the backlash was so strong that Turning Point, which is Charlie Kirk's, you know, organization, they organized their own Super Bowl performance to protest, and it was very white, very, very, very white, which is insane that the reaction to Bad Bunny was that strong, and people could not stand it, that there was another Super Bowl performance, which is insane, absolutely insane. But if you really think about it, you know, Super Bowl has always been political, just like anything else, you know, with that patriotic image, the national anthems, the military flyovers. And, you know, I think what the key difference here is that, you know, those politics are considered neutral. But Bad Bunny's performance and, you know, therefore by extension politics, it's considered disruptive because they come from the margins. And, you know, just like the Adelaide Writers' Week, the discomfort is not really about, you know, the content or what's happening. It's about who is centering the narrative. And I think, you know, we as a society are really used to what politics is safe, what stories are safe, what voices are safe. And in this context, like, safety is who has the power and the privilege, and it was rewarded by the systems that we live in. And, you know, I think Bad Bunny's performance is coming at a time where there is so much inflammation in America at the moment, and so, like, a lot of race wars, cultural wars. You know, we're living in a time where ICE is just completely trampling on people's human rights. And regardless of your politics, like, how are we living in a world where people are being referred to as illegal aliens? That's so dehumanizing. We're living in a time where people are being killed and dying by the hands of a government agency who should be following a legal due process. I mean, and this is what I'm saying, regardless of your politics. I mean, personally, I do not agree with what ICE is doing at all. At all. But regardless of your politics, you know, there is a there should be a basic regard for human rights and human lives. But we're living in a time where people are being completely dehumanized, and it's okay. Like, this behavior is being enabled, and when it's being enabled like that, you can see how the stereotypes and the prejudice and the ignorance, all of that can just run rampant. And it is being, run rampant in America right now. So then when you have Bad Bunny, who comes and performs at a stage which is like all American, it is absolutely insane. Absolutely insane. I think when you talk about Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance, it's really important to talk about the context and what's happening in America right now. And the response and the backlash to Bad Bunny. Oh my gosh, yeah, that was so Somali of me. We don't have a lot of B's and P's in our mother tongue, and so it's really common to get that mixed up. Oh my gosh, it was so Somali of me. I love that. Bad Bunny. Anyways, the backlash to Bad Bunny's performance, it says a lot about where America is at the moment, in terms of accepting other cultures, where America is at with attitudes towards migrants. It says a lot about the working class. It says a lot about who apparently is considered American and who isn't. And so I think it's really important that, when we do talk about events like this, we get deep with it, to be honest, essentially, because there's a lot to be said here, and even, regardless of what your politics are, having the deeper conversation behind all of this, I think will help all of us in the lens in which we view this world. So, I know that, what happened with Adelaide Writers' Week and the reaction to Bad Bunny's Super Bowl performance are happening in different arenas. They are part of the same story, and I really want to unpack what that story is, because it may seem like the thread that connects these two things together is controversy and, for lack of a better word, shock value, because this, when these things were going down, it was really hard to escape it, in the sense that it was on social media, it was in the news, it was, people were talking about it, and so that shared thread is not controversy, it's not politics, it's not even really speech, it's institutional fear, because both of these moments, what they show is what happens when marginalized voices enter highly visible mainstream spaces that were historically controlled by elites, publishing boards and committees and broadcasters and sponsors and advertisers and governments. And, these, especially, not just when, and it's not even just when marginalized voices enter these hyper-visible spaces, it's also when these marginalized voices enter the scene when it's really, really inflamed. And this would be a great opportunity for these institutions to welcome these voices as an opportunity to be like, let's talk about this and let's get deeper with it. Like, imagine if the Adelaide Riders Week board, they didn't cancel Randa's panel invite. And I'm not saying that now Randa has this responsibility to kind of speak for communities, especially in response to the Bondi Beach attack. But even having Randa there, it sends a message and it sends a signal when there is a lot of noise happening, and that would have been a wonderful opportunity for that. But you have to remember that these institutions, they are not built primarily, in fairness and to pursue justice. They are there to preserve reputation and to maintain funding, to avoid scandal and to protect continuity. And so essentially they're built to pursue stability. And so I think that's why, with both of these events, the reaction is not necessarily to the content of the speech, but to the risk of reaction. In Adelaide's case, the board said Randa's appearance might be inappropriate given recent tragedy. And for Super Bowl, critics said that oh my God, I've done it again! Bad Bunny's performance was too political for a national event, even though Bad Bunny is an American. And, in both cases, there is that similar logic, and logic in air quotes that appears, which is we must protect the public from discomfort. But discomfort is not danger. And I think if we leaned into that conflict more, the world would look like a different place. It really would, if we were able to embrace that discomfort. Because when we embrace that discomfort, we're able to get really real with it. And when we get really real with it, we're talking about our lived experiences and how that interacts with the systems and the structures and institutions that we work and live and play amongst, where the power lies and who does and doesn't have it. I think we are not able to have conversations like that until we lean into the discomfort. And so discomfort is not danger. And I think this argument that I'm about to get into, it just shows why it's so important that any kind of medium where stories are told, whether it's music or concerts or performances, anything in the public sphere, it's so important, because they can be and are platforms for this quote-unquote discomfort. Political philosopher Hannah, and I feel like I'm going to say the last name incorrectly, but Arendt, Arendt, argued that public sphere exists precisely so conflict can be visible rather than suppressed. And we need that disagreement, because that disagreement is kind of that catalyst and that spark that causes the fire. And I think, that fire is where we can really talk about things and challenge and highlight the situation for what it is. And that's what the public sphere exists for things to be visible rather than suppressed. And so when you have things like Adelaide Writers Week and Super Bowl happen, you can see how, the system will try to suppress, because we need that. We need that public sphere to perform its function of making things visible rather than suppressing things. And so you can see how what institutions fear the most is not harm necessarily, it is the loss of narrative control. Because, when marginalised voices speak, they challenge dominant stories, they complicate national myths, and they introduce histories and stories that were previously invisible. And I think that's why these cultural moments provoke such intense backlash, because, culture is where identity is rehearsed. And so I think this overlap between Adelaide and Bad Bunny is so important, because both moments exposed that quote-unquote neutrality is actually a political position in itself. And neutrality always favours the status quo. And, this is where I think my man James Baldwin can really help us out and help us make sense of what's really going on. Because Baldwin has always said and believed that societies construct myths about themselves, myths of innocence and unity and moral superiority. And when those myths are challenged, people really experience it as attack. And not even just people, like systems and institutions as well. They really experience it as an attack. He wrote that Americans were not afraid of violence. They were afraid of what black people revealed about America. And I think, even though it's different communities being spoken about here, that insight really travels well and translates well here, because Bad Bunny is not controversial because of music. Palestinian authors not controversial because of literature. They're controversial because they expose histories of colonialism, racial hierarchy, migration, exclusion, political conflict. And I think it's, if we combine what Hannah and Baldwin have said, it's the role of the artist is to disturb the peace. So not to create chaos, but to reveal truths that comfort hides. And then we turn to our girl, Bell Hooks. And I think Bell Hooks adds just another really important layer to this corridor, which is, representation alone is meaningless unless it comes with power. And so, institutions love diversity posters, they love inclusive language and symbolic inclusion, but, ultimately resist structural change and shared authority and that uncomfortable critique. And I think that's what's really key here when we talk about, the Adelaide Writers Festival and Bad Bunny's performance. And so, when Bad Bunny performs, it looks like inclusion, and when a Palestinian author is invited, it looks like diversity. But we need to remember sometimes that diversity is often used as a mask to cover up inequality. So when the moment their presence disrupts dominant narratives, inclusion turns into discipline. And so this shows us that the conflict is not about speech, it's about who is allowed to define what is normal. And, what I was saying before was that this pattern is not isolated, it is global. For example, let's talk about PEN America. So PEN America stands for Poets, Essayists and Novelists. It was founded in 1920 to defend writers against censorship and political persecution. And so their mission is literally to protect free expression and defend the rights of writers. Yet in 2024 to 2025, PEN America faced mass boycotts from authors who accused it of failing to defend Palestinian writers and speech critical of the state of Israel. And so, when the boycott was happening, writers argued that PEN applied free speech selectively, it avoided political risk, it prioritized donors and political alliances. And I think this one really hits deep because an institution built on free speech became an institution accused of managing speech. And so I think it shows that free speech in practice is never abstract. It's always shaped by power. And then you think about museums like the Tate-affiliated galleries and Brooklyn Museum that have cancelled or postponed exhibitions involving Gaza, colonial violence, racial justice, Indigenous history, and staff and artists alike have staged walkouts arguing that museums were silencing political art, again prioritising donor comfort and presenting themselves as neutral while making political decisions anyway. And I think, what makes this one particularly interesting is that museums are like archives of history, and Aurelia Azole, an art historian, puts it quite well when they wrote that museums often function as colonial archives, preserving some histories while erasing others. So when museums claim neutrality, they're actually defending a particular version of history. And again, safety becomes a cover for control. Then we can talk about Eurovision, a contest which claims to be apolitical, but every year war references are censored, LGBTQIA plus visibility is politicized, national identity becomes controversial, and so Eurovision allows national pride but not political critique. And that tells us that, not all politics is banned. It's only disruptive politics. And I think the same thing applies to Bad Bunny's performance. Patriotism is allowed, but migration stories are not. And then we just talk about TikTok as a platform. And TikTok bans and restrictions, they've been framed as, national security, therefore child safety, and therefore misinformation. But research by the Electronic Frontier Foundation and human rights groups shows that marginalised creators are disproportionately affected by bans and restrictions. Political organising content is more likely to be flagged, and Palestinian, black and queer creators face higher takedown rates. So, when you put those two things together, again, protective language masks as political control. And so, one thing that we really need to talk about here is safety versus power. Because I think, when I think about what cultural safety is, to me, cultural safety is care that protects and respects identity, protection from discrimination, and acknowledgement of trauma. But in this context, cultural safety has kind of become, it's been rebranded into this, we don't want to cop heat, basically. We don't want controversy. And the controversy is always... controversy is always suppressing the genuine discomfort over the state of our world and our systems and institutions. And so, that always comes at the cost of the marginalised, and it just serves the status quo. And And, even if you kind of step away from cultural safety, just true safety in general, and this can apply to any kind of relationship, true safety involves listening, context, conversation, accountability, and false safety is silence, erasure, and risk avoidance. And so, if you take this back to the Adelaide Writers' Week, when the board made the decision to remove an author, it didn't make people safer. It, in fact, made people angrier. It completely collapsed that trust with the board, because safety without justice is not safety. It's comfort, essentially. So I think the main thing that I really, really want to highlight here is that, cancellation in this context, in this pattern, is not the product of too much sensitivity. It is the product of too little imagination, because institutions and our current structural powers can only imagine two choices: platform or cancel. But what it looks like when we embrace that discomfort and just honestly come to the table and talk about these things, there is a third option that suddenly emerges, which is engage. If we just take a step back from Bad Bunny and the Adelaide Writers' Week, imagine if we chose the third option more. We could have opportunities to contextualize the moment, to acknowledge that grief and conflict, to invite multiple perspectives and champion many stories, not just, serve the story that upholds the status quo, but instead they choose to either platform or cancel. And I think, that's why Baldwin said the purpose of art is to lay bare the questions that have been hidden by the answers. And even just laying it down like that, you can see how that asks of courage and being inclusive and redistributing that power. But that asks institutions and organizations to not, give in to that fear and be able to see the situation for what it is. Because I think when you're able to do that, you don't just automatically affirm the status quo. And I think, what does that accountability look like in this space? And I think it's transparent decision making. It is shared power with artists and communities. It is clear ethical principles, and it's a refusal to confuse discomfort with danger. And I think, as consumers, the way that we respond to things can really help institutions and these structural organizations to move more to accountability. We as consumers and customers, we do have the power to demand that. But I think that's why it's so important that we get deep with these conversations, so we're able to put ourselves in a position that we can ask for that accountability. And it's really, really important to talk about this, especially because we are living in a time where there's so much misinformation in our digital media. We're living in a climate crisis. We're living in highly political times. Here in Aotearoa, it's election year. We are living in times where there is war everywhere. And I think culture is where these tensions really surface. And they surface quite early. So when you think about the pattern that we've spoken about today, Bad Bunny, Adelaide Writers Week, museums, Pen America, TikTok, Eurovision, these are not just scandals. They are symptoms, and they are telling us that, democracy is being rehearsed through culture, which is why it's so important that we talk about this now and why it matters now. We're living in a time where there is so much going on. There's so much inflammation. There's a lot of conversations happening around systems and power and structure, especially now that the Epstein files have come to light. That has triggered a lot of conversation in this space. So, how do we talk about these things? And this could be an amazing opportunity to look at our world, look at our structure, really get into why is it that things are the way that they are? Who is it that's being silenced? Who is it that's being marginalized? Who is it that's being dismissed? Because if we start answering those questions, it will really change the way in which you look at this world. And I'm not here to say that then, if we're able to really crack this open and have an open discussion about it, I'm not saying that I have all the solutions or that the solutions will come easy or will be very clear cut. I think it is going to be complicated, but the solution lies in having these really difficult conversations and being really open and honest about it. And so with the world that's so inflamed right now, so acutely inflamed right now, how we respond is very telling of where we will go next. For example, even though you could just say it's just a Super Bowl performance, but the reaction to it is very telling. It's more than just a performance. Imagine if we as a society were more open about things and we got real with what, why is it that it is so triggering. We could be talking about migration and ICE and, how we in our structures and our systems are able to dehumanize people to the point where they're called, illegal aliens. It feels so strange even saying that out loud. So I think it's really important that we talk about these things because essentially Bad Bunny did not break the Super Bowl. A Palestinian author did not break a writer's festival, but what broke was the illusion that culture can remain neutral when justice is demanded. Silence is not peace, and freedom without justice is empty. And so I think it's really important that we talk about these things and not just talk about it online, but we have this conversation with our family and our friends, and we as individuals seek that information and learn more about history, because information is eye-opening and powerful and transformative. Even if it's something that you are outraged by, go deeper, go further, have these conversations, because we need to. We really need to determine where we're going to move next. So I think it's really important that we hold on to that messiness, keep asking those questions, keep choosing courage over comfort. Thank you for tuning into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. Catch you for the next one.
Thank you for tuning in into another episode of Headscarves and Good Yarns. To keep spinning the yarns, let us know your thoughts. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram at Headscarves and Good Yarns, or email us at headscarvesandgoodyarn@gmail.com.
This podcast was produced by OAR FM Dunedin with support from New Zealand On the Air.